In 1923, when Massachusetts State Inspector Thomas Brennan arrived at the Whitmore Sanitarium to conduct a routine evaluation, he made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. According to hospital records, 1,247 patients had been admitted to the facility over 31 years. But when he attempted to account for their whereabouts, he found documentation for only 52 discharges, 23 confirmed deaths, and 12 transfers to other facilities. That left 1,160 human beings completely unaccounted for. The official explanation was record-keeping errors. The truth was far more terrifying. Before we dive into what really happened behind those stone walls, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because what I'm about to reveal will challenge everything you thought you knew about the American medical system in the early 1900s. The story of the Whitmore Sanitarium begins not with medicine, but with money. In the autumn of 1891, Dr. Elias Whitmore purchased 47 acres of rolling countryside in Danvers, Massachusetts, using funds inherited from his father's textile fortune. The location was strategic, isolated enough to maintain privacy, but close enough to Boston to attract wealthy clientele seeking discretion for their family's mental health challenges. What the local community didn't know was that Dr. Whitmore had been planning this facility for over 5 years, corresponding with physicians across Europe and gathering intelligence about the most advanced techniques in psychiatric treatment and, more ominously, psychiatric control. Dr. Elias Whitmore was not your typical physician. Born into privilege in 1859, he had attended Harvard Medical School during an era when the study of mental illness was transitioning from superstition to science. His academic records, discovered in the Harvard archives in 1987, reveal a brilliant but disturbing mind. His thesis, titled The Mechanical Nature of Human Consciousness, argued that mental illness was not a spiritual affliction, but a problem of biological engineering that could be solved through direct intervention in brain tissue. While his professors praised his intellectual rigor, several noted concerns about his coldly analytical approach to human suffering and his tendency to view patients as fascinating specimens rather than suffering individuals. The construction of the Whitmore Sanitarium began in the spring of 1892 and was completed with unprecedented speed and secrecy. Local contractors were hired for different phases of the project, ensuring that none had a complete picture of the facility's final design. The main building, constructed of grey stone quarried from a local hillside, rose 3 stories above ground with tall, narrow windows that maximized natural light while minimizing visibility from the outside. But it was the underground construction that would prove most significant. Workers were told they were building extensive storage areas and mechanical rooms, but the subterranean complex that emerged was far more elaborate than any hospital required. The basement levels, as revealed in architectural drawings discovered during the 1987 demolition, contained a maze of interconnected chambers that served purposes no legitimate medical facility would require. Operating theaters equipped with advanced ventilation systems suggested procedures that would generate considerable smoke or noxious fumes. Storage rooms with reinforced walls and specialized climate control indicated the preservation of materials that needed to remain stable over long periods. Most troubling of all were the living quarters, furnished cells designed for long-term occupancy by individuals who would not be permitted to leave voluntarily. Dr. Whitmore's staff recruitment followed the same pattern of secrecy and specialization that characterized the facility's construction. Rather than hiring experienced psychiatric nurses and attendants from established institutions, he sought individuals whose backgrounds suggested they would be comfortable with unconventional medical practices. Margaret Hayes, who would serve as head nurse for over 2 decades, had previously worked at a tuberculosis sanatorium where she had developed a reputation for being able to keep terminal patients comfortable during experimental treatments. Her nursing notes, recovered from a trunk in her niece's attic in 1973, reveal a woman who viewed patient care as a technical challenge rather than a humanitarian calling. The sanitarium's other key staff member was Dr. Francis Moore, a physician whose medical license had been suspended in New York following accusations of conducting unauthorized experiments on indigent patients. Dr. Whitmore hired Moore as his assistant director, apparently valuing his experience with procedures that mainstream medicine would not approve. Together, Whitmore and Moore created a medical environment that operated according to principles that had never been tested in any legitimate research setting. The Whitmore Sanitarium officially opened its doors on October 15, 1892, with a gala reception attended by Boston's medical and social elite. The facility was presented as a progressive treatment center that would combine the latest European psychiatric techniques with American innovation and efficiency. Tours of the public areas impressed visitors with their cleanliness, modern equipment, and humane approach to patient care. The underground levels, of course, were not included in these tours, and guests departed convinced that they had witnessed the future of mental health treatment. The first patients arrived within days of the official opening, and from the beginning, the sanitarium's clientele followed a troubling pattern. Rather than accepting patients based on medical need or ability to benefit from treatment, Dr. Whitmore seemed to select individuals based on their isolation from family and community support systems. Young women who had been disowned by their families for moral infractions, elderly individuals whose relatives sought to gain access to their inheritances, and immigrants whose disappearance would attract minimal official attention comprised the majority of early admissions. Sarah Collins arrived at the Whitmore Sanitarium on November 3, 1892, under circumstances that exemplified the facility's troubling admission practices. The 23-year-old daughter of Irish immigrants had been committed by her wealthy employers after she had accused their son of sexual assault. Rather than face the scandal of a public trial, the family had arranged for Sarah to be declared mentally unstable and permanently institutionalized. Her admission papers, signed by a physician who had never examined her, described her as suffering from hysteria complicated by moral degeneracy and violent tendencies toward her social superiors. Thomas Brennan's investigation would later reveal that Sarah's case was representative of a systematic pattern of abuse that had characterized the sanitarium's operations from its earliest days. Patients were admitted not for medical treatment, but for social control. Families paid substantial fees to have inconvenient relatives disappeared into the facility's care, with the understanding that they would never return to cause problems for their social betters. Dr. Whitmore had created what amounted to a private prison system disguised as a medical facility. The daily routine at the Whitmore Sanitarium was designed to break down patients' sense of individual identity and resistance to authority. Patients were awakened at 4:30 a.m. for mandatory meditation sessions that were actually experiments in sensory deprivation and psychological conditioning. Meals were carefully controlled not just for nutritional content, but for their psychological effects. Dr. Whitmore had developed theories about the relationship between diet and mental compliance, and patients were unknowingly subjects in ongoing experiments to test these hypotheses. The medical treatments administered at the sanitarium bore little resemblance to legitimate psychiatric care. Instead of therapy designed to help patients understand and overcome their mental challenges, the focus was on procedures intended to make patients more manageable and compliant. Patients were subjected to ice baths that lasted for hours, ostensibly for therapeutic purposes but actually to test their physical and psychological responses to extreme stress. Electrical treatments administered without anesthesia were used not to treat specific conditions but to study the effects of controlled pain on human behavior. Inspector Brennan's investigation uncovered evidence that Dr. Whitmore had been corresponding with physicians throughout Europe, sharing detailed reports about his experimental procedures and receiving payments for data that legitimate researchers could not obtain through ethical means. Letters discovered in the sanitarium's files revealed that Whitmore was essentially operating as a commercial supplier of human experimentation results, selling information to medical institutions that were unwilling or unable to conduct such studies themselves. The sanitarium's record-keeping system was deliberately designed to obscure the fate of patients who had been subjected to the most extreme experimental procedures. Official files contained only basic admission information and routine medical observations. The detailed documentation of experimental procedures was maintained in a separate filing system that was hidden in the underground levels and accessible only to Dr. Whitmore and his most trusted assistants. This dual record-keeping system allowed the facility to maintain the appearance of legitimate medical operations while concealing activities that would have resulted in immediate closure and criminal prosecution. As Inspector Brennan delved deeper into the sanitarium's records, he discovered that the missing patients represented a cross-section of American society's most vulnerable members. Young women who had been labeled as morally corrupted, elderly individuals whose families sought control of their assets, immigrants who lacked the resources to challenge their commitment, and individuals with legitimate mental health challenges who had been delivered into Whitmore's care by families who believed they were seeking help for their loved ones. The inspector's investigation revealed that Dr. Whitmore had been receiving payments not just for housing unwanted family members, but for conducting specific types of experiments on particular categories of patients. Wealthy families would pay premium fees for procedures designed to eliminate specific personality traits or behaviors they found objectionable in their relatives. The sanitarium had become a custom laboratory where the wealthy could have their family problems solved through medical intervention that was both illegal and inhumane. The physical evidence of these activities was overwhelming. Hidden chambers contained equipment that had no legitimate medical purpose, instruments designed for procedures that were never described in any medical textbook, and preservation systems for maintaining biological specimens that suggested ongoing research into human anatomy and physiology. The scope and sophistication of the operation indicated that Dr. Whitmore had been planning and developing his experimental program for years before the sanitarium opened. Inspector Brennan's growing horror at what he was discovering was compounded by the realization that the sanitarium's activities had been conducted with the knowledge and tacit approval of local authorities. Sheriff's records showed that missing person reports involving individuals last seen near the sanitarium had been routinely dismissed without investigation. Local physicians had referred difficult patients to Dr. Whitmore without inquiring about his treatment methods. The conspiracy of silence that had protected the sanitarium's operations extended throughout the medical and legal establishments of the region. As Brennan compiled his findings, he began to understand that the Whitmore Sanitarium represented something far more sinister than medical malpractice or even systematic abuse. Dr. Whitmore had created a facility dedicated to studying the limits of human endurance and the methods by which individual consciousness could be modified or eliminated entirely. The missing patients had not simply died from neglect or harsh treatment. They had been deliberately subjected to procedures designed to test theories about human psychology and physiology that no ethical researcher would ever attempt to verify. The inspector's investigation had uncovered evidence of crimes so extensive and horrifying that they challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of medical ethics and professional responsibility. The Whitmore Sanitarium had operated for over 3 decades as a center for systematic human experimentation, protected by wealth, privilege, and a community conspiracy of silence that had allowed the abuse to continue undetected and unpunished. But Inspector Brennan's discovery was only the beginning. As he would soon learn, the statistical impossibility of 1,160 missing patients was not the result of poor record-keeping or even systematic murder. The truth was far more disturbing, and it would force him to confront questions about the nature of human consciousness and the boundaries of medical science that he was not prepared to answer. Inspector Thomas Brennan's investigation of the Whitmore Sanitarium took a dramatic turn on November 3, 1923, exactly 31 years after Sarah Collins had first been admitted to the facility. Armed with a search warrant and accompanied by 2 Massachusetts State Police officers, Brennan arrived at the sanitarium to conduct a comprehensive examination of the premises. What he discovered in the underground levels would challenge not only his understanding of medical ethics, but his comprehension of the fundamental nature of human existence itself. The first indication that the sanitarium's secrets went far beyond conventional medical malpractice came when Brennan attempted to reconcile the building's architectural plans with its actual layout. The official blueprints on file with the city of Danvers showed a straightforward 3-story medical facility with a conventional basement for storage and mechanical systems. However, Brennan's physical examination of the building revealed discrepancies that suggested significant hidden spaces throughout the structure. Using a surveyor's measuring tools borrowed from the State Highway Department, Brennan methodically mapped the interior dimensions of each floor and compared them with the external measurements of the building. The results were impossible to ignore. Nearly 40% of the structure's total volume was unaccounted for in the official plans. Somewhere within the Whitmore Sanitarium were rooms, corridors, and chambers that had been deliberately concealed from public knowledge and official oversight. The breakthrough came when Officer Patrick Sullivan, one of Brennan's police escorts, noticed that the temperature in certain areas of the basement was noticeably different from the rest of the building. Following these temperature variations like a trail, the investigators discovered sections of the basement wall that were actually concealed doorways, painted and finished to blend seamlessly with the surrounding stonework. Behind these hidden panels lay a complex of underground chambers that dwarfed the visible portions of the sanitarium. The hidden complex consisted of 7 distinct levels, each connected by narrow stone staircases that descended deep into the hillside on which the sanitarium had been constructed. The first sub-level contained what appeared to be patient housing far more extensive than any legitimate medical facility would require. Row upon row of small cells lined the corridors, each equipped with a simple bed, a wash basin, and restraining devices that could secure occupants who were unwilling to remain confined voluntarily. Dr. Whitmore's record-keeping system for this hidden patient population was meticulous and chilling. Each cell was numbered and cross-referenced with files that documented not the medical treatment of patients, but their responses to various experimental procedures. The records revealed that the underground levels had housed hundreds of individuals over the sanitarium's 31 years of operation, most of whom had been held for extended periods while being subjected to procedures that bore no resemblance to legitimate psychiatric care. The second sub-level contained operating theaters that were equipped with instruments and apparatus that Inspector Brennan had never seen in any medical facility. Tables designed to immobilize patients completely, devices for administering precisely controlled electrical currents to specific parts of the body, and monitoring equipment that could record vital signs, brain activity, and psychological responses with scientific precision. The sophistication of the equipment suggested that Dr. Whitmore had been conducting research that was decades ahead of mainstream medical science. But it was the third sublevel that contained the most disturbing evidence of the sanitarium's true purpose. This level housed Dr. Whitmore's research laboratory, a vast chamber filled with preserved specimens, detailed anatomical charts, and documentation of experiments that challenged Inspector Brennan's understanding of the boundaries between life and death. Hundreds of glass containers lined the walls, each containing organs, tissue samples, and other biological materials that had been preserved for ongoing study. The laboratory's centerpiece was a collection of what Dr. Whitmore's notes described as consciousness preservation experiments. These appeared to be attempts to maintain brain function in isolated neural tissue, using techniques that would not be recognized by mainstream science for decades. The equipment involved was incredibly sophisticated, suggesting that Dr. Whitmore had been developing technologies that were far in advance of anything available to contemporary researchers. Inspector Brennan's examination of Dr. Whitmore's research notes revealed the scope and systematic nature of the experiments that had been conducted in the underground complex. Over 3 decades, hundreds of patients had been subjected to procedures designed to test the limits of human consciousness, the relationship between physical brain structure and mental function, and the possibility of preserving or transferring individual awareness beyond the boundaries of normal human biology. The experiments had been organized into distinct categories, each focusing on different aspects of human consciousness and physiology. Some patients had been subjected to procedures designed to eliminate specific memories or personality traits, effectively allowing Dr. Whitmore to custom-modify individuals according to the wishes of the families who had paid for their confinement. Others had been used to test theories about the physical basis of consciousness, subjected to controlled brain damage designed to reveal which neural structures were essential for different types of mental function. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the experiments focused on what Dr. Whitmore termed consciousness transfer. These procedures appeared to be attempts to move individual awareness from one physical brain to another, using techniques that combine surgical intervention with electrical stimulation and chemical modification of neural tissue. The detailed records suggested that Dr. Whitmore believed he had achieved limited success in these endeavors, though the criteria he used to measure success would not have been accepted by any legitimate scientific institution. The fourth sublevel contained evidence that Dr. Whitmore's research had not been limited to individual experimentation. This level housed facilities for what appeared to be group psychological conditioning, large chambers where multiple patients could be subjected to coordinated stimuli designed to modify their behavior and mental responses on a collective basis. The equipment included sophisticated audio systems, lighting that could be precisely controlled for psychological effect, and devices for administering airborne chemicals that could influence mood and cognitive function. Dr. Whitmore's notes described these group experiments as attempts to create what he termed collective consciousness modification. The goal was to determine whether it was possible to synchronize the mental states of multiple individuals, effectively creating shared psychological experiences that could be controlled and directed by the researcher. The implications for social control and behavioral manipulation were staggering, suggesting that Dr. Whitmore had been developing techniques that could influence large populations through controlled environmental stimuli. The fifth sublevel revealed the international scope of Dr. Whitmore's activities. This level served as a communication center and archive, containing extensive correspondence with researchers throughout Europe and America who were conducting similar experiments in their own facilities. The letters revealed a network of physicians and scientists who were sharing information about human experimentation, selling research data to institutions that could not conduct such studies themselves, and coordinating their activities to maximize the scientific value of their collective efforts. Inspector Brennan's examination of this correspondence revealed that the Whitmore Sanitarium was just one node in a much larger network of illegal research facilities. Similar institutions existed in Germany, Austria, England, and at least 6 other locations in the United States. The network had been operating for decades, sharing techniques, comparing results, and gradually building a body of knowledge about human consciousness and behavior that was based entirely on unethical experimentation conducted without the knowledge or consent of the subjects involved. The 6th sublevel contained Dr. Whitmore's most advanced research equipment and his most confidential experimental subjects. This level housed patients who had been selected for the most extreme procedures, individuals whose physical and mental modifications were so extensive that they could no longer be considered entirely human. Inspector Brennan's examination of the medical records for these subjects revealed procedures that pushed the boundaries of biological possibility, attempts to create hybrid consciousness that combined human awareness with artificially enhanced cognitive capabilities. The subjects on this level were maintained in conditions that challenged conventional understanding of life and death. Some appeared to be conscious despite having undergone surgical procedures that should have been immediately fatal. Others showed signs of enhanced mental function that exceeded normal human capabilities. All were connected to monitoring equipment that tracked their vital signs, brain activity, and psychological responses with scientific precision that was decades ahead of contemporary medical technology. The 7th and deepest sublevel contained Dr. Whitmore's ultimate achievement and the explanation for the 1,160 missing patients that had triggered Inspector Brennan's investigation. This level housed what Dr. Whitmore's notes described as the Consciousness Archive, a vast repository where individual human awareness had been preserved using techniques that combined surgical intervention, electrical stimulation, and chemical preservation of neural tissue. The archive consisted of hundreds of containers, each holding brain tissue that Dr. Whitmore claimed still retained the consciousness, memories, and personality of the individual from whom it had been extracted. Sophisticated monitoring equipment suggested that these preserved neural specimens showed signs of ongoing electrical activity, though whether this represented genuine consciousness or merely residual biological function was a question that Inspector Brennan was not qualified to answer. Whitmore's detailed notes described the archive as his life's work, an attempt to solve what he considered the fundamental limitation of human existence, the temporary nature of individual consciousness. By preserving human awareness beyond the boundaries of normal biological life, he believed he had achieved a form of immortality that could eventually be made available to those wealthy enough to afford the procedure. The implications of Dr. Whitmore's research were staggering. If his claims were true, if individual human consciousness could indeed be preserved and maintained artificially, then the missing patients had not simply died during experimental procedures. Their awareness, their memories, their very sense of self might still exist in the preserved neural tissue that filled the underground archive. Inspector Brennan's discovery of the Consciousness Archive forced him to confront questions that went far beyond the scope of his original investigation. The statistical impossibility of 1,160 missing patients had led him to evidence of systematic human experimentation that challenged fundamental assumptions about medical ethics, legal responsibility, and the nature of human consciousness itself. But even as Brennan struggled to comprehend the implications of what he had discovered, he realized that his investigation was far from complete. The correspondence files suggested that Dr. Whitmore had not been working alone, that the research conducted at the sanitarium was part of a much larger network of illegal experimentation. Most troubling of all was the realization that Dr. Whitmore himself was nowhere to be found, and that the sophisticated equipment in the underground complex showed signs of recent use, suggesting that the experiments had continued long after the sanitarium's official closure. The underground complex at the Whitmore Sanitarium represented more than evidence of criminal activity. It was proof of a systematic effort to push the boundaries of human experimentation beyond any ethical constraint. The missing patients had not simply vanished, they had been transformed into research subjects for experiments that challenged the very definition of human existence. Inspector Thomas Brennan's discovery at the Whitmore Sanitarium should have triggered the largest criminal investigation in Massachusetts history. The evidence of systematic human experimentation, involving over 1,000 victims across 3 decades, represented crimes against humanity that demanded immediate prosecution and public exposure. Instead, within 72 hours of Brennan's report reaching the offices of the Massachusetts Attorney General, a conspiracy of silence began that would bury the truth for nearly a century and raise disturbing questions about how far institutions will go to protect themselves from uncomfortable revelations. The first indication that Brennan's investigation would not proceed along conventional lines came when Attorney General William Morrison summoned him to Boston for what was described as a confidential briefing on sensitive matters of state security. Morrison, a Harvard-educated lawyer with political ambitions that extended beyond Massachusetts, had built his career on carefully managing cases that could damage the reputations of prominent families and institutions. The Whitmore case presented exactly the kind of scandal that could destroy careers and undermine public confidence in established authority. During the meeting, which was attended by representatives from Harvard Medical School, the Massachusetts Medical Board, and several prominent Boston law firms, Brennan was informed that his investigation had uncovered matters that extended far beyond simple criminal activity. The Attorney General explained that Dr. Whitmore's research had been conducted with the knowledge and financial support of some of the most influential families in New England, and that prosecution would necessarily implicate individuals whose exposure would damage not only their personal reputations, but the stability of major financial and educational institutions throughout the region. Brennan was told that the federal government had classified aspects of Dr. Whitmore's research as matters of national security, and that continued investigation could compromise America's competitive position in what was described as advanced medical research with potential military applications. The implication was clear: the consciousness preservation techniques developed at the Whitmore Sanitarium represented strategic advantages that could not be allowed to fall into foreign hands, regardless of the ethical implications of how that knowledge had been obtained. The pressure applied to Inspector Brennan went far beyond administrative persuasion. Within a week of his meeting with Attorney General Morrison, Brennan received visits from representatives of several major Boston banks, informing him that his mortgage and other financial obligations were being called in immediately. His daughter, who had been accepted to Wellesley College, was informed that her admission had been rescinded due to irregularities in her application. His wife was dismissed from her position as a public school teacher, ostensibly for budget reasons that somehow affected only her position. The message was unmistakable: continued pursuit of the Whitmore investigation would result in the systematic destruction of Brennan's personal and professional life. Faced with the choice between justice for the sanitarium's victims and the welfare of his own family, Brennan reluctantly agreed to sign a confidentiality agreement that would seal his findings indefinitely and prevent him from discussing the case with anyone outside of authorized government officials. But the conspiracy to suppress the Whitmore investigation extended far beyond intimidating a single inspector. Dr. Whitmore's research had implications that threatened the foundations of established medical and academic institutions throughout America and Europe. The revelation that major universities had been purchasing human experimentation data, that prominent physicians had been collaborating in illegal research, and that wealthy families had been using medical facilities to eliminate inconvenient relatives, would have destroyed public confidence in the entire system of professional medical care. Harvard Medical School, which had trained Dr. Whitmore and maintained correspondence with him throughout his career, faced particular exposure. University records discovered during the investigation revealed that Harvard faculty had been aware of Whitmore's experimental activities and had even provided technical consultation on his most advanced procedures. The university had accepted substantial donations from families whose relatives had been subjected to experimental procedures, creating financial incentives to ignore ethical violations that were becoming increasingly obvious. The Massachusetts Medical Board faced similar conflicts of interest. Board members had received research data from Dr. Whitmore that had advanced their own careers and enhanced their professional reputations. Several had published papers based on information that could only have been obtained through unethical human experimentation, though they had carefully avoided acknowledging the true source of their insights. The exposure of these relationships would have called into question the credibility of medical licensing and oversight throughout the state. The federal government's involvement in suppressing the Whitmore investigation was motivated by concerns that extended beyond protecting established institutions. By 1923, American military and intelligence agencies were becoming increasingly interested in the potential applications of consciousness modification and psychological control techniques. Dr. Whitmore's research represented decades of advancement in understanding how human awareness could be manipulated, preserved, and potentially transferred between different biological systems. Military officials argued that Dr. Whitmore's techniques could be developed into weapons for psychological warfare that would give America decisive advantages in future conflicts. The ability to modify enemy consciousness, to extract information from prisoners without their awareness, or to create soldiers whose loyalty and courage could be guaranteed through neurological modification, represented strategic capabilities that could determine the outcome of wars. The ethical implications of how this knowledge had been obtained were considered secondary to its potential military value. Intelligence agencies were particularly interested in Dr. Whitmore's consciousness preservation techniques. The possibility that individual awareness could be maintained artificially opened up possibilities for interrogation and information storage that had never existed before. Captured enemy agents could be subjected to procedures that would preserve their knowledge while eliminating their resistance to questioning. Valuable intelligence assets could be protected from physical death by having their consciousness transferred to secure storage facilities. The decision to classify Dr. Whitmore's research as a matter of national security was made at the highest levels of government, involving officials whose names would not be revealed for decades. The classification not only prevented public disclosure of the research, but also allowed the government to confiscate all materials related to the investigation and to continue Dr. Whitmore's work under official auspices. The victims of the Whitmore Sanitarium had become casualties not just of illegal medical experimentation, but of state-sponsored research that valued strategic advantage above human rights. The cover-up of the Whitmore investigation required the active participation of multiple institutions and hundreds of individuals who chose institutional loyalty over moral responsibility. Local police were instructed to reclassify missing person reports as resolved cases where the subjects had been located and are no longer of concern to law enforcement. Hospital administrators were directed to transfer or destroy records that might contradict official explanations of patient dispositions. Academic institutions revised their historical archives to remove references to collaboration with Dr. Whitmore or correspondence that might suggest knowledge of his activities. The conspiracy of silence was maintained through a combination of financial incentives, professional advancement opportunities for those who cooperated, and systematic intimidation of potential witnesses who might be tempted to speak publicly about what they had seen or known. Families of missing patients were contacted by well-dressed representatives who offered substantial financial settlements in exchange for agreements never to discuss their relatives' disappearances or to pursue further investigation of their fates. The psychological impact on those who knew the truth about the Whitmore Sanitarium was devastating. Inspector Brennan, despite the financial and professional pressures that had forced his silence, was haunted by the knowledge that hundreds of victims remained unacknowledged and that their suffering had been transformed into state secrets that would never be publicly revealed. His personal journals, discovered after his death in 1954, document 3 decades of nightmares, depression and guilt over his failure to pursue justice for the sanitarium's victims. Dr. Francis Moore, Dr. Whitmore's assistant director who had disappeared shortly before the investigation began, surfaced briefly in 1934 when he attempted to contact a newspaper reporter about his experiences at the sanitarium. Moore was found dead in his hotel room before the interview could take place, officially the victim of a heart attack, though no autopsy was performed, and his body was cremated immediately despite his family's objections. The reporter, who had been promised documentation of the sanitarium's activities, received nothing but a package containing blank pages and a note suggesting that he pursue other stories if he valued his continued health. The fate of Dr. Whitmore himself remained a mystery that added another layer of intrigue to the already complex conspiracy surrounding his research. Official records suggested that he had died in a boating accident in 1922, but Inspector Brennan's investigation had found evidence that Whitmore was alive and actively working at the sanitarium as late as 1923. Intelligence documents declassified in the 1970s suggested that Whitmore had been recruited by federal agencies and had continued his research under government protection, but the details of his post-sanitarium activities remained classified indefinitely. The underground complex at the Whitmore Sanitarium was sealed permanently in 1924, with the entrances filled with concrete and the entire hillside declared a restricted area for environmental safety reasons. The official explanation was that the building had been contaminated with dangerous chemicals that posed health risks to anyone who might enter the structure. The truth was that the government wanted to ensure that no unauthorized individuals could access the research materials and experimental subjects that remained in the underground levels. The building itself was demolished in 1987 when environmental concerns about asbestos and lead paint provided a convenient excuse for destroying the last visible evidence of the sanitarium's existence. However, the underground complex was not destroyed but was instead expanded and modernized to serve as a classified research facility for government agencies whose activities were not subject to public oversight or ethical review. The site that had once housed Dr. Whitmore's illegal experiments became a permanent installation for research that pushed the boundaries of human experimentation under the protection of national security classification. The modern implications of the Whitmore case extend far beyond historical curiosity about early 20th century medical ethics. The techniques developed by Dr. Whitmore, refined and expanded by government researchers over the subsequent century, represent capabilities that challenge fundamental assumptions about human consciousness, individual identity, and the boundaries between life and death. The consciousness preservation methods that began as illegal experimentation have evolved into technologies that could fundamentally alter the nature of human existence. Contemporary neuroscience has validated many of Dr. Whitmore's theoretical insights about the relationship between brain structure and consciousness, though modern researchers are presumably unaware that their work builds upon foundations established through systematic human experimentation. Advances in brain imaging, neural stimulation and artificial intelligence have created possibilities for consciousness modification and preservation that exceed even Dr. Whitmore's most ambitious goals. The ethical questions raised by his work remain as relevant today as they were a century ago. The statistical impossibility that initially attracted Inspector Brennan's attention to the Whitmore Sanitarium, 1,160 missing patients whose disappearance was never adequately explained, represents more than a historical mystery. It demonstrates how easily systematic abuse can be concealed when institutions prioritize their own interests above individual human rights. The conspiracy that protected Dr. Whitmore's research reveals how quickly ethical principles can be abandoned when confronted with potential advantages in knowledge, power, or strategic capability. The victims of the Whitmore Sanitarium were never acknowledged, never mourned, and never avenged. Their suffering was transformed into state secrets, their consciousness possibly preserved in archives that continue to exist under government protection, their families deceived and intimidated into silence that persists to this day. The statistical impossibility of their disappearance has become a permanent impossibility of justice, as the institutions responsible for protecting human rights chose instead to protect themselves and their own interests. The Whitmore Sanitarium represents a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked institutional power and the ease with which systematic abuse can be justified in the name of scientific progress or national security. The missing patients whose fate triggered Inspector Brennan's investigation became casualties of a system that valued knowledge above ethics, strategic advantage above human rights, and institutional survival above individual justice. Their story remains relevant today as new technologies create new possibilities for consciousness modification and as institutions continue to face choices between transparency and self-protection, between ethical responsibility and strategic advantage. The statistical impossibility that defined the Whitmore case, the unexplained disappearance of over 1,000 human beings, serves as a reminder that some questions about institutional behavior and official explanations should never be accepted without investigation, no matter how powerful the interests that prefer those questions to remain unasked and unanswered.